right, good morning, everyone. Y'all look bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. So I titled this presentation, Opportunities Abound for Citing Banks on Public Lands. So why aren't bank sponsors biting? And by public lands, I'm really talking about BLM managed lands. And we actually are getting a few nibbles. We have had a few, probably 1-2 bankers come in and be interested in doing banks on public lands. It's probably going to take us a little while to get those first ones going because it's new for us, just like it was in the past when we were ramping up in California for conservation banking. But it's the pioneers. It always takes a little longer. So today I just want to give a little bit of background, need for restoration. Talk a little bit about opportunities for the restoration industry, a few hurdles, and a few solutions. Okay, so our, BLM's, Bureau of Land Management's organic act, so to speak, is FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. And we are required to manage the public lands for multiple use and sustained yield. And, oops. Yeah. And so I think it's worth just taking a look at that because I think when people hear multiple use, they think, oh, extraction, like oil and gas, mining, or grazing, or things like that. But it's more than that. And so I'm just going to read this, pardon me, but a combination of balanced and diverse resource uses that takes into account the long-term needs of future generations for renewable and non-renewable resources, including, but not limited to, recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, wildlife and fish, and natural, scenic, scientific, and historic values, and harmonious and coordinated management of the various resources without permanent impairment of the productivity of the land and the quality of the environment, with consideration being given to the relative values of the resources and not necessarily to the combination of uses that will give the greatest economic return or the greatest unit output. And I'm not sure everybody really realizes that. And then sustained yield means what you would think it does, the achievement and maintenance in perpetuity of a high-level annual or regular periodic output of the various renewable resources of the public lands consistent with multiple use. So a mouthful, but I think it's important that we look at those actual definitions that are in the Act. Okay, so to achieve this mandate, we absolutely have to require compensatory mitigation of permittees for authorized land uses that adversely impact important, scarce, or sensitive resources. We also need to restore lands that are damaged, degraded, or fragmented from past land uses, authorized or otherwise, or natural things like catastrophic wildfires, that sort of thing. And then we have to protect intact lands and restore landscapes. So we can do that a number of different ways. Different land designations, some of which Congress imposes, but some of which BLM has the ability to designate, like ACECs, areas of critical environmental concern, lands we can designate. We can identify lands with wilderness characteristics. National conservation lands have protection. So, and then we can restrict uses on particular areas by applying things like a no surface occupancy, things like that. So we have the ability to do this. And important, scarce, and sensitive resources are identified through the NEPA process, sometimes through the process when we're doing a land use plan or resource management plan, revision or amendment, or for individual development projects. And then if something's changing as far as land use in a land use plan with an individual project, then we go and we also amend the land use plan that covers that area. Okay, so I'd estimate here BLM spends about $200 million on restoration annually, which sounds like a huge number, but when you think about the fact that we're managing over 245 million acres of surface land, that's like less than $1 an acre annually. So it's a big number, but it's not covering everything we need. And so you can see kind of the money is mostly going to fire and fuels reduction, post-fire work, aquatic wildlife T&E species restoration. So there's 3 examples here. The second one I really want to point out to this audience, and that is that more than half of BLM managed streams and rivers in the continental U.S. are considered degraded and have lost more than 1/3 of their aquatic insect diversity. So these are areas, and then these lands are mostly in the west, arid west, and it's really important that those streams, wetlands, wet meadows, those sort of things maintain their function, value, biodiversity. So there's a lot of opportunity there to do restoration. And then non-native invasive grass cover in the west is kind of eating our lunch. So that's another area where there is a possibility to do restoration more in the form of invasive species control and continued management of those invasive species on the landscape. Okay, so let's get to a few more opportunities. So we think of restoration activities along a continuum. So everything on the one end from like remediation, reclamation, mitigation, rehabilitation, revegetation, ecological restoration, and then you get to conservation at the other end. So there's a lot of latitude there to work with. So if there's, risk aversion to doing a bank, or you're just not willing to take that big step for a mitigation project, there are other potential opportunities to do restoration through, in a non-market, venue through like grants, contracts, respond to RFPs with proposals, things like that. But we really want to see banks and these, or even these large compensatory mitigation projects, and to the extent possible in advance of the impacts. Okay, so a few hurdles, and these are the common ones that we hear about all the time. And if you were in the Monday session, you heard Lindsay listing these, and we talked a little bit about some of them, but additionality, durability, equivalency, agency capacity to process bank applications within a reasonable amount of time, and then lack of agency-trained staff as far as compensatory mitigation and approval of compensatory mitigation projects. So just briefly, a few solutions. So additionality, really careful site selection when it comes to multiple use lands. You're not going to cite them where there are valid existing rights that are not compatible with the mitigation project. You're going to, if there are other uses already on the landscape, if they're compatible with what the compensatory mitigation project is, great. If they're not, move on to another site. And then, uplift created for measurable outcomes above baseline is going to be the same on public lands as it would be on private lands. I don't see a difference there. I know that is an issue for some folks. They feel like it's, since the land is so-called protected, that should reduce the available credits. But these lands are not protected, and but for one of these banks or compensatory mitigation projects being established in that area, it's not going to happen. Or it's not going to happen anytime soon, maybe not in our lifetimes. And then durability. So under FLIPMA and our implementing regulations, we're really fortunate, unlike Forest Service or Park Service, we actually have the ability to grant leases for long-term leases for conservation purposes, for mitigation purposes, essentially, restoration. So that lease will look very much like a conservation easement on private lands. We can't grant them in perpetuity, but we can grant them for long term, and it should be commensurate with the duration of the impacts. And other requirements for a bank or an in-lieu fee program, the same as you would have on private lands. So it's really the only different thing is that conservation easement versus one of these leases. Okay, equivalency. Due diligence on the part of bank sponsors to assess the competition and potential competition on private lands. So really, bankers need to do that market research and see what's out there, potentially what's out there, what's happening. And of course, BLM will share any information we have on potential competing projects. And there shouldn't be any issues with competition that's located also on the BLM managed lands. The issue has been for a number of bankers, banks within the same service area on private land and public land, where private land bank would have a disadvantage in competing because of costs. And I think you have to just start doing the numbers and seeing if that's really the case with cost. But we also have the ability to set service areas and limit or eliminate that competition in some cases. So it's an it depends situation. Okay, so during our very first workshop here, our public lands workshop in 2019, one of the outcomes from that was under the high effort, high impact quadrant, was the need for more specific policy guidance and templates. And so we're working on that. We got our mitigation manual and handbook back out. We've gotten a couple of instruction memorandums out that address some of the issues with compensatory mitigation on public lands, and we're pulling together some templates and tools. So, and one of those tools you might have heard about if you were in my session yesterday, and that is this national level mitigation and conservation account MOA that we entered into, this agreement we entered into with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which is really, I think it's going to be really good for getting essentially permittee responsible mitigation on the ground much more quickly and probably much more effectively with a better outcome than if we just left it to the project proponent themselves. All right, so training, we did fund training. We brought the compensatory mitigation course to Phoenix end of last year, and we also provided some funding to secure some seats for BLM in the national offering that's happening in June at Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center. So doing that, and then in-house, we're doing little bites here and there. We just did a big training at our training facility in Phoenix, where we did a couple sessions on mitigation strategies and mitigation banking. And obviously everyone complains we're short-staffed, but we are hiring more staff, and I think the new bill and IRA, so the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation and Reduction Act, are providing a lot of funds, and some of those are going to be used to hire staff to get some of this stuff done. And I actually think some of those funds can also go out to the private sector through contracts to do restoration. That's kind of in the works. And at the policy roundtable later today, you might hear some more about that. Okay, so that's all I have today. Do we have time for a question?
We're going to do one question,
okay,
and we need hands raised so we can get a mic to you. And then there'll be more questions at the end.
That was convenient.
I was a little disappointed to hear the high percentage of degraded streams on BLM property. And my mental picture of BLM property is relatively remote, relatively undisturbed property, which, so wouldn't have the normal causes of stream degradation. What do you see as the typical cause of degradation on your properties?
So I haven't been out there in the ground a lot recently, but I remember years ago when I first was working for a consulting firm, and we were going out and we were meeting with BLM, and we were looking at a lot of areas in the Mojave Desert and stuff, and grazing and just abuse by users, recreation users and things. And that's a problem because there's not, on the protection side, law enforcement side, that's something that we really need to think about. Now with climate change, things are drying up. I think there's going to be a reduction in grazing in a lot of areas, particularly in places like Nevada where they just can't sustain grazing. I mean, it's not even going to be profitable for, folks with grazing leases to continue to do that. So, but yeah, I definitely need to get on getting, and then, invasives, arundo out there in some of these areas has been a huge problem. Okay, I'm gonna move on. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. So stay around because Deborah will be here through this whole session. We're definitely going to talk more at the end. And with that, we're going to bring up another one of our speakers, Mindy Gotsagen. I emphasized it incorrectly the first time. And Mindy's going to be sharing about a really cool program that she's been supporting for a while in Colorado, looking at also doing mitigation on public lands.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I'm Mindy Gotsagen. I'm the Conservation Services Manager with the Colorado State Land Board, and I'm going to talk about a different kind of public land where we are already doing some mitigation banking. So we started a program, it's called the Ecosystem Services Program. It's kind of code for mitigation banking, but it is more inclusive. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And most of the photos you're going to see are state trust lands and also some of the sites for mitigation banking, with one or two exceptions. So our general purpose and the purpose of this program is to generate revenue or earn revenue for school kids from ecosystem services. For those of you who remember the Millennium Assessment, ecosystem services are all it's all the services that the world provides. So obviously everything that we have is an ecosystem service. But our board chose to call this program our Ecosystem Services Program. And I'm going to start with a little history lesson, just 2 minutes, because how many of you were raised in one of the 13 original colonies or had their education in the original 13 colonies? I'm originally from New Jersey. I didn't know what state trust lands were when I moved out west 30 years ago. But state trust lands are those kind of school sections, the checkerboard pattern that you often see if you're visiting out west or you look at maps from out west. And they're a different kind of public land. The founding fathers, just 10 years after the Revolution, and even before, 5 or 7 or 8 years before the Louisiana Purchase, had to figure out how to admit new states and how to administer and to give them full rights, but also how to divide up the land. And so there were two. So here's our founding fathers at the Second Continental Congress, and they passed 2 laws in rapid succession that had to do with the Northwest. And this Northwest at the time, from the colony's perspective, was Ohio out to Wisconsin. And they created 5 states, and these 2 laws set forth the pattern of how land would be developed, and also accomplished one of the most crucial things for a new democracy is how do we create an educated citizenry. And so in that, they created these state trust lands, and 23 states or so still have these. I didn't bring my computer, and I can't really read that, but so the trust lands are basically based and created to create this educated citizenry. And I'm going to show you a little bit. The next slide will show you some. But today, 23 states still have state trust lands. Those are the states shown in tan with the blue lands are the trust lands. the blue states that don't have those, the mapping wasn't available, and then the white states no longer have state trust lands. So starting with the state of Ohio, the very first state created in 1801, every state got state trust lands or the equivalent of other things to support the public education. Today, these total, does that say 515 million acres? That actually includes all the subsurface assets as well. The surface assets are 68 million acres, and then the subsurface assets, there's actually 3 layers of mineral assets, and together they total up to 515 million acres. And then finally, they generate, I think that's over 6 billion in annual revenue. Is that what the number says? 4, sorry. So, and all that money goes predominantly to public education. Most states, including Colorado, has a few other small little things like universities or the prisons, the state park system, but for by and large, 99.5% of our revenue goes to support public school kids in the state of Colorado. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about Colorado. There we are. And here is a state map showing our state trust lands. This is our surface acreage. But generally speaking, underneath every one of those blue spaces, we also have the mineral assets. It's a little bit of difference there. But starting with the state of Ohio, the federal government set aside, when they created the state, that enabling the federal enabling legislation, they set aside Section 16. As the states became more arid, they got extra lands. In Colorado, we got Sections 16 and 36. And actually, New Mexico and Arizona got 2 extra as well as 4. So they have quite a bit of state trust lands. And so we were created in 1876. And we today have 2.8 million acres of surface land and 4 million acres of subsurface land. So what guides us today? The State Land Board is our mission is to manage an endowment of assets held in perpetual intergenerational public trusts for the financial support of Colorado's public schools. Our mandate is to generate reasonable and consistent income and protect and enhance the natural values as much as possible. We used to be held to a higher standard, well, not a higher standard, but we used to have to maximize our revenue. And about 25 years ago, there was a law passed, actually the voters of the state amended the state constitution to enable us to just generate reasonable and consistent revenue and also include stewardship values. And then finally, one of the most important one is that our fiduciary duty is we have a legal and ethical obligation to act solely in the best interest of our trust beneficiaries. So we do not act in the interest of the state of Colorado, of the citizens of the state. We act in the best interest of our trust beneficiaries, which is the school kids of Colorado. Our mission is to generate revenue for them. And this guides how we're approaching this ecosystem services program. So we are basically a giant leasing agency, and we lease for various different types of lands. These are all technically the ecosystem services because they're the services that the earth provides. And historically, over time, when, is this working? I can't see, can you see a red dot? Oh, there we go. But anyway, up in the left, for 100 years or so, for the first 100 or 50 years of statehood, we generated revenue from grazing and from mineral development. Then came oil and gas, and then slowly came these other lines of business. Ecosystem service was created about 10 years ago. We had a new director who had a banking background and came in and basically said, our leasing revenue programs are basically lines of business. I want to have you start thinking about them like that. And they assigned to me having the ecosystem services program. So it started in 2013. Our goal was to monetize those ecosystem services that weren't monetizable before under kind of traditional markets, and the new markets that were created by regulatory development of wetlands and certain types of wildlife habitat could now be monetized. And so we began to look at the functions of streams and rivers, which would be mitigation banks. Actually, we're also looking at capturing revenue from the carbon cycle through carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat through conservation banks, and finally, biodiversity offsetting and insetting, which would be voluntary payment for ecosystem services. So these are all of our lines of business. I want to point out that we don't get into the line of business. We just lease this to our lessees, or they're not really our partners, but we don't go out and buy cows and graze them and then auction them off. We don't do the oil and gas development ourselves. We have our lessees do that. And we use that same model to work with mitigation banking. So by doing that, what we did, I'll just pause for a second here. This shows kind of the growth of our leases over those 10 years, starting with 2 in the first year and rising up to now we have 15. And the different colors show the yellow is our voluntary payment for ecosystem services. We had a prairie dog relocation project that we accepted prairie dogs, one of the most hated species in the West. We accepted them on one of our 40,000 acre or 25,000 acre ranches as part of a RTD, a Regional Transportation Department light rail project. So that's that yellow line on the bottom. And then those blue lines, those blue bars are our planning leases. I'll talk about how we work with the mitigation bankers to first create a planning lease where they can do their due diligence. And then when they're ready to kind of say, we're ready to go and this bank project is proving out. It looks like we have support from the Corps, and I'll talk a little bit about the trigger about what takes a project from a planning lease to a production lease. But it's basically they know it's going to prove out, and they want the state land board's commitment to put a permanent conservation easement on the project site. And then finally, just in the last 2 years, we've had a forest carbon lease. Today we have these 15 leases. This is by type. 8 are wetland mitigation banks, 3 are stream mitigation banks, 2 are species banks, so the voluntary payment for ecosystem services, and 1 is that forest carbon lease. Now this chart does show both the planning, the leases that are still in the planning phase. In most cases they've had at least a prospectus report delivered with comments back from the Corps, or they've even gone a little further than that, but includes all of those together. So both the planning and our production leases. We currently have 3 approved banks on our property, 1 species bank, 1 wetland bank, and 1 stream bank. And this shows our revenue over the last 15 years. So it doesn't look so good, does it? Because for the first 9 years or so, we get a ground rent from the mitigation banker for using controlling that property per se. But we really know that the real money is going to come from the sale of credits. And so the way that our leases are structured is that we get a gross percentage of the credits that are sold. We don't control the sale of the credits. We don't really have a voice in how they're sold. We trust, just like we do with our other lessees in other lines of business, we trust that they know the business well, and we just get a percentage of the final credits that are sold. Partly because we're a public agency. We also have a difficult process in selling things in terms of we have to have either auctions or bids or things like that. And as you know, the mitigation banking market is extremely opaque. We can't really find out what other bankers are selling their credits for. And so for us to get into that business would be very kind of problematic. And so we leave that to our mitigation banking partners or lessees, and we just get a percentage of those credit sales. And so another reason it took a long time is that there were steep learning curves, not just for me personally, but our board, our senior staff. That was also true for our staff and board members, the IRT members of state agencies and other federal agencies that were on the IRT, these first projects. We were right at the leading wave or cusp of mitigation banking market kind of projects in the state. There had been a couple of approved mitigation banks, but they were few and far between. And the state of where we're at now, 10 years later, is very different than it was in 2013. The federal agencies also went through their own learning curve. And during this process, the first commercial species conservation bank was the project on our property was approved, but that took a long time to work out. And We also had submitted the first stream mitigation projects in the state, and then the state, Army Corps and the EPA took a step back, put a lot of things on hold as they developed a stream quantification tool and mitigation procedures for the state. And so that also happened, I think, in 2017 and 2018. There's that. And then finally, there was significant staff turnover at the Corps and staff cutbacks with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And all of those things contributed to the length of time it took to get some of these projects moving forward. So these are our current bank sponsor or lessees. We have Sandy Creek Partners. They're known as SCP Conservation in the state of Colorado. Burns and McDonnell. Ecosystem Investment Partners. Conservation Investment Management is Ben Guillon's company. They were the ones that did the first species conservation bank in Colorado. And then the city of Colorado Springs is actually a PRM lessee. They're looking at doing a fen restoration project in the mountains of Colorado on state trust land. And so I'm just going to go through just some of the photographs. This is our Species Conservation Bank in Larimer County, Colorado. The state of Colorado has very few. We have under 20 endangered species. And that includes the grizzly bear, which I don't think there are any plans to reintroduce that to Colorado. This was there had only been one mitigation bank for Prebbles Meadow. It was a PRM project that the Colorado Department of Transportation had done, but this was the first commercial mitigation bank, and credits have been purchased mostly by reservoir projects or reservoir expansion projects within that Huck 8. We have wetland and stream mitigation banks. Colorado is a very arid state. We only have 14 inches of rain a year. I think that's what Denver gets. Some parts get a little more, some parts get a lot less. Compared to that, I think the state of Florida gets, I thought it was 60, it's 70 inches of rain, so it's a very different kind of environment. But we do have wetlands, and those are highly prized. This is one of our wetland mitigation sites. Forest carbon is also a project. This isn't obviously a traditional mitigation bank, but we are looking at how we can capture carbon sequestration credits through reforestation projects. This is our Crystal Mountain property that was burned a year and a half ago in the largest wildfire in Colorado history. It's over about 208,000 acres, the Cameron Peak Fire. One of the challenges of this kind of project is actually access, just getting into some of these areas. And I think access is a big issue anywhere, but I think it's especially challenging in the West, where you have these large expanses. You don't have a lot of roads. It's a challenge for us. I'm sure Dublin's a challenge for BLM. Just getting, even if the site is good, and it's in an area where there's a demand for credits, you can't always get to it, and that can add to the cost of a project. And then a voluntary payment for ecosystem services. This is just a photograph from the relocation of prairie dogs. Took a lot of heat on that one, but anyway, there is money to be made. There's a lot of desire to relocate prairie dogs away from urban areas for projects, mostly housing developments or commercial developments, and it's near impossible to get them relocated. So even though I can show that we can make money, our board is not willing to take on more of these projects. And so I just wanted to pause for a minute and just go through some key program elements. And I have 2 minutes, okay. The State Land Board prefers a relatively low risk profile. So what we do is we offload a lot of risk onto our mitigation banking partners, and then and in return we get actually a lower percentage of the profit from the credits. We opted on a first come first served basis. We don't put out RFPs. We basically make available our website. There's our land portfolio. If there's a property that you're interested in, think has potential for mitigation bank, please let us know. Interested bankers view so this is what I just said, they view our land portfolio. Our leases are structured to align our interests as close as possible with that of the mitigation bank sponsors. And that works very well except for two items. One is the profit sharing part of the credits, and the other one is the monetary amount of the long-term management plan. And there's a two-stage leasing process. We have a 2 to 4 year planning lease, whether you pay ground rent only, and then a 5 to 15 year production lease during the time of the active bank. We did provide a non-compete area. I can talk a little bit about that if there's time or during questions. And we will continue to own and manage the project of a bank closure. We've been around for 150 years. We plan to be around for as long as the state of Colorado is around. And then this is just a graphic showing these three phases of a bank. You have the preliminary planning, active bank, and bank closure. And then this aligns with the structure of our planning lease, production lease, and endowment fund. So those are the three stages that you're all familiar with. And finally, this is a map. Well, this is a map that shows the Huck 8 areas where we have bank projects located in. The pink shows the urban areas, and you can kind of see the blue is the distribution of our state trust lands. I didn't talk about why we don't have any out west. Those were Native American territories at the time of statehood. And then we just have worked with a couple of partners over the years giving us guidance. As I mentioned, this is a very opaque industry, and so we needed people to help us understand this. And over the years, we worked with these different companies. We currently worked with Creek Bank Associates to kind of take a look, again, at future and emerging markets. How can we best position ourselves? And those two areas that we're really focused on moving forward, in addition to more mitigation banks, are grassland carbon through the practices of regenerative grazing, and also voluntary payments for enhanced biodiversity through companies that want to do some insetting for corporate responsibility. And that is it. So.
I think we'll hold questions.
Okay.
If that's okay,
Sure. Yep.
Okay, folks, we're going to hold questions for Mindy till the end because I want to make sure we have that bunch of time at the end. So with that, and I'm going to actually just, I'm going to say that I love prairie dogs, and it's one of my favorite things about living in Colorado. I just want to put that out there for the prairie dog. I know, right? So with that, I want to bring up our next speaker, Michelle Matson, working for the Corps IWR. She's going to be talking to us about the Sustainable Rivers Program, and I'm excited to hear Michelle talk about this because she's very passionate about it. Every time we talk offline, she is thrilled to talk about this project in general, so it's great to have her here speaking about it formally to you all. So with that, Michelle.
If you guys have listened to any of my shenanigans in the last couple days, you know I get excited about all things ecosystem restoration, right? And I don't like this setup. I would want to be down there, but I'm going to try to do both two devices here. Okay, so I wanted to introduce this community to the Corps' Sustainable Rivers Program, or SRP. It is not a regulatory program. Funding comes through operations to IWR to manage. And I'm not really supposed to describe it this way, but this is the way it makes a lot of sense to me. It's essentially an internal grant program. Districts, planning and operations divisions apply to our RFP, which just goes out, via email, and they fill out a spreadsheet basically that just says, hey, I want to look at operations and see if I can do something cool here on existing core facilities. So the money is all internal. My idea here is that their actions create ecosystem restoration opportunities beyond the Corps' properties. And so let me give you a brief overview of the program as well as several example projects. Did I go? Yay. Okay, so the mission of SRP is to improve the health and life of rivers by changing infrastructure operations to restore and protect ecosystems while maintaining and enhancing other project benefits. If you guys are familiar with Corps Civil Works and locks and dams or other dams, Those projects are approved by Congress, and they have very strict requirements or authorized uses, right? So it could be flood control, commerce, whatever they are, and those purposes have to be maintained unless they go back and get permission to change those. Often there is an authorized purpose for conservation or recreation or those types of things as well, right? But this program funds evaluating existing facilities within the boundary of their existing authorized purposes. This program is in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, which I also find to be very unique to the Corps. The Nature Conservancy actually initiated this program way back 20 years ago with the Green River. They had been working with that district to try to see if the Corps would change the way they released water from that facility to improve environmental conditions. The district was willing, which was rare for operators at the time, and from that came an MOA with the Nature Conservancy, between the Corps and the Nature Conservancy. So I just wanted to put up the mission of the Nature Conservancy is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends, right? Could be quite different in a lot of ways from the mission of operations, right? They, like our Congress, have some very, not strict, but sort of big goals before 2030 of improving conservation, improving fish habitat, purchasing lands, all of these things. And they are working now to develop their metrics and targets for this period of time. So that is, is to come. So the goal of the Sustainable Rivers Program is to advance, implement, and incorporate environmental strategies at existing core facilities. So we have this this program. Every project goes through this phased process. First, advance, implement, incorporate. So advance is just doing your baseline studies, identifying what your opportunities are, what your constraints are, what's the flexibility within the operation management plan, right? Every facility has a plan. Oh crap, see, this is the problem. I'm only gonna be able to do one thing at a time, I'm sorry. Implement is where they've already met with their stakeholders, they understand what their potential opportunities are, and they work with scientists, universities. USGS does quite a bit of work with the Sustainable Rivers Program on monitoring, and they start to test these these ideas, right? It's like doing your conceptual design for an ecosystem restoration project, and you're moving through the process. You get out there, maybe you do your grading, but you're in the middle of grading and you adapt, right? You're like, oh, I didn't plan to go. I messed up on my elevation of my floodplain, and you adapt. So that's what this implement phase is, and then incorporate. Ideally is when they either modify the manual for operating that facility, lock, dam, whatever, or they do an amendment to that plan. That's a big deal. Like, it's a really big deal. In order to update those manuals, it takes several years. Often needs to go to Congress for approval, et cetera. I haven't been involved in any of those activities yet, and there's only been 3 or so of the SRP projects that have gotten to that point. Okay, so in 2022, the program had 7 rivers in the program, but because of our rapid increase in budget, we're expanded quite a bit. So up until for 17 years or so, the program was funded with about $400,000 a year. So very small program. It jumped in 2020 thanks to the Nature Conservancy lobbying for more money for this program. It jumped to $5 million. And that, we get our money usually in January, February-ish. So in 2020, we had to all of a sudden go from funding 7 projects with $400,000 to spending $5 million. Because I'm sure you've heard, there's been a couple of people like, don't give the money back, right? And if you carry over money, your program looks like it's failing, even if you only get it midway through the year. But we've been, revamping the program to deal with this bigger budget, all really, really good, but managing a $400,000 program relative to a $5 million program, very different. And then this year jumped to $7 million. So it was in the president's budget for $7 million, and it just got approved. I just added that bar this morning. It actually was approved a couple months ago, but I didn't update the dealio. Okay, so now this is what our program looks like. 44 rivers are in the program. Most are in that first phase of advance, right? Because we've only had this additional money for a few years, but there are several that have gone that are in implement, as well as a few into incorporate. So, do I have a pointer? I have a pointer. Do I not have a pointer? I don't have a pointer. Anyway, okay, so there are, I'm gonna look here. There are colors coded, so all of the orange are the advanced, so those are our new rivers in the last few years. And the purple ones are implement, so there's, I think, 5 or 6 of those guys where they're actually testing their, environmental flows or conservation locking to get better environmental benefits. And then there are 3 or 4 rivers that are in incorporate, where they've modified those water control manuals, and we've moved them into our science program or our science group, and they're doing just more intensive monitoring, most in partnership with USGS, to collect some pretty intensive data to see if we can apply that information to either the region or across the enterprise, so that the other programs or the other river projects can move quicker into, through those phases. Okay, so I'm just gonna give you a few examples of the projects. This is Des Moines River. It's one of our science rivers. It's been in the program for quite a few years, so since 2015. And I'm not gonna go through all of this information because I don't know it. But I want to highlight just this bottom section here so that you can see what some of the proposals that are ongoing. These were proposals as of last year, but they've all been funded. So they are looking at and implementing floodplain restoration work. They are developing a stewardship plan for the forest within the floodplain, doing ecological assessments, and then expanding to other facilities. Like, really great results in a fairly short period of time, and creating restoration opportunities up and downstream beyond the Corps' control. So all of these programs do not work in a vacuum within the Corps. They are all required to have stakeholder involvement. But I'm not sure that they've ever engaged, a business community like banking or in-lieu fee sponsors to come out and look at these potential opportunities within their basin to see if there's some other things that they can do that would actually help these resources, right? So let me go to the next slide here. Upper Mississippi River, we have several projects on the Mississippi, and you can just see from all of the work they're doing. They've been doing environmental pool management, where they lower or raise the level of the pool in order to get some habitat growing where it would normally just be flooded or it would be mud flats. So changing how much water they hold, when they hold it, to improve habitat and then improve fish and bird food production and spawning, right? Just very simple. A couple years ago when I got involved in this project, it was a complete shift for me from being a sort of classic ecosystem restoration person where you're looking at a site and removing fill material or figuring out how to restore the stream under current or changed hydrologic conditions because there's more urban runoff or whatever. This is just changing the way water is managed to get environmental benefits, and huge successes are coming out of the program. So another example in Mississippi River, we're gonna see this site in 2 weeks. We're having our national meeting here. So the dam managers adjusted the outflows from the Mill Price Dam and now have moved on to several other facilities. And for the first time in 30 years, got lake sturgeon spawning in this area. And we were just notified a few weeks ago that this year they came back and were spawning. And there's videos on YouTube and on the district website, like really cool, right? And if they're spawning here with all of these facilities, again, maybe there's more opportunities for the private sector to get in and do some work, adjacent so that we can get better outcomes. Where am I now? Okay, so I just pulled these in this morning because I love the project manager for Allegheny River, which is on the Ohio, or is a tributary to the Ohio, is a brilliant scientist, Marianne Divers, and she just took over the program. Not that they weren't doing a great job before, but she's really connected with the academic community in this area, and she's just coming out of the gates like gangbusters, getting universities involved, students out there, collecting all kinds of information, has a contract with USGS. So I think that this program is going to grow very quickly. I've talked to her about banking, which of course she's like, I don't even know what that is, and in lieu fees, and she's like, yes, let's talk. Let's see if there are things that I can't do that they could potentially do for us. So they're collecting right now all kinds of baseline biology information about the fish community, mussel community for water quality. We tend to put that under the water quality, on threatened and endangered species, and then of course invasive species. So lots of needs at these areas once they start that are owned by the Corps, like properties that are owned by the Corps or their adjacent public lands that need funding, right? So this could very well tie into what Devlin and others are talking about, restoration on public lands. I'm not getting it to go. It doesn't like me. Okay. So, and looking at restoration opportunities or other impacts that have happened within that drainage area that they don't necessarily have access to. So impacts that have occurred from coal mining. Let's see, what else do I have? And then where conservation lands, recreational areas are occurring. Where state game lands are located and what their plans are. So really collaborating across many different entities, and I can't get it to go. I have the worst luck with these things. Okay, I'm sorry. I can be very professional. Okay, so right now our objectives for location-based work, so we call each of these sites location-based works, are to accelerate implementation and incorporation. Again, I think partnering is one way we can do that. Expanding SRP geographically, you saw that we have 44 rivers right now in the program, but that is a drop in the bucket compared to what the number of core facilities. I think that we estimate that's like 30% of the Corps' portfolio. So broadening the types of environmental actions to achieve the sustainable management. So we've started to look at invasive species removal. It's a little bit controversial for the operations division. Starting to look more at water quality proposals that are coming in from the district, a little bit of physical habitat enhancement, and then more recently, dry dams, and particularly in the arid West, where there are several facilities, so Seven Oaks Dam and Folsom Dam are utilizing other core modeling tools, CRIDA and FIRO, pretty cool tools, you should look those up. I think one is out of IWR, CRIDA is out of IWR, and FIRO is out of ERDC. And just looking for, ways of managing facilities in light of climate change, in light of very little water in those areas. So maybe not be dry dams anymore where the water just flows through, but instead retaining some of that water to deal with issues of not enough water in California. But that could then lead to additional actual on-the-ground habitat restoration opportunities. I really am pushing the button. So this is just to say that we are having our national meeting to sort of celebrate and talk about lessons learned from the last 20 years of the program, and then strategize for the next 20 years. We have lots of bigwigs coming from headquarters, which is really cool, as well as from, I think ASA, I don't know, I don't remember. And then we're trying to link all of these different teams across the country to start sharing information, sharing tools that they've utilized, and then connecting with partners. And then we're gonna go visit that Mel Price Dam, and maybe the sturgeon will still be spawning, probably not. But anyway, lots of growth opportunities here, and that's what I've got. That's what I've got. There are two SRP websites, one on the Nature Conservancy's website, or for Sustainable Rivers, but on the core website out of HEC, the Hydrologic Engineer Center, which is located in Davis, California, but that's part of IWR, and then one on the TNC website. Quite different, like TNC does like really cool, pretty websites and stuff, and the core does very rigid. But all of this is public knowledge, so all of the documents that are funded through SRP, just like any other publicly funded efforts, everything that's final is on the website or being uploaded to the website. We're doing a big push right now of documents from the last 5 years or so you can go and look and see what they're doing, what baseline studies they've done, what opportunities they've identified, and what stakeholders they're engaging. That's all I have. Thank you. Oh, do I have a question?
Okay, we're going to continue to hold those questions till the end because I want to make sure we have time for everybody to be able to present. So last but not least, we have John Yershon. Awesome. Presenting, and we're going to kind of be stepping away from public lands and moving more into urban settings and stormwater, which is, in my mind, as equally exciting as public lands and these opportunities for large-scale restoration, and that our urban settings are another really awesome place to be talking not only about our markets, but our opportunities to do some really creative things where there's a lot more infrastructure and constraints. So with that,
Hey, good morning, guys. Such an honor to share the panel with you all. So my name's John. I'm a partner at Magnolia. I bring maybe a little bit of a different perspective. We're a mitigation provider, so talking about stormwater markets in the U.S., this is kind of certainly an emerging market, one that we've gotten involved in over the last couple of years, and excited to share some of the things we've learned and some of the opportunities that may exist in this space. So where are we going? So first, I just want to touch on what are stormwater credits, and then a case study from Washington, D.C., and then a discussion about where this particular segment of the mitigation or offset universe may be going. So first, just wanted to touch on an important distinction which is between water quantity and water quality. There have been other discussions at this conference about water quality markets. Mark, who's over there, led a panel on Tuesday talking about water quality offsets. And an important distinction here is today we're talking about water quantity. So we're talking about capturing, in particular, stormwater, urban runoff, as opposed to water quality projects. So water quality projects are typically about capturing things like phosphorus and nitrogen, typically in a more rural setting. Water quantity is talking about capture of urban stormwater. So what does this look like in practice? This is kind of like the image of what is the problem? Like this is like the problem, right? It's heavy rainfall events, typically in areas where there's a lot of impervious surface, draining into waterways and then putting strain on sewer treatment systems. So this is another image showing like the problem. This is Washington, D.C. Anything that's shown in blue here is an impervious surface. So in these urban cities, we have areas where we have a large percentage of impervious surface, and those create a situation where when you have these rainfall events, you're capturing pollutants and you're putting strain on these sewage treatment systems. So an important discussion on stormwater markets is understanding the distinction between what's called a combined sewer outfall or CSO area versus an MS4 area. So in our older legacy cities in the United States, we have CSO areas in most of the major cities. Basically what that means is that when you have these rainfall events, stormwater, so that's to say the rain that's falling into the city, can be combined with sewage that's flowing through the pipes, and that creates the conditions where in extreme rainfall events, you're going to put a lot of strain on those sewage treatment systems, and it can be very expensive for cities to retrofit those systems to make them work for the people of those cities. So this is a map that shows all the cities that have these CSO, these sort of legacy sewage treatment systems. You'll see that a majority of them are in the Northeast and Midwest, which makes sense because these are typically older cities. And these are some of the cities where we're seeing, I think, the largest growth of stormwater offset opportunities, because what cities are realizing is that it's quite expensive to retrofit these systems using traditional gray infrastructure, and so there's more of an appetite for what we call green infrastructure. So I think, as is often the case in an emerging market, there are a couple of different threads that are coming together to create an opportunity. So some of the threads here: one, we have increasing population density and impervious surface in these urban centers. Two, increasing costs to retrofit these existing systems. Three, increasing frequency of extreme rainfall events. And then fourth, increasing consciousness around topics like environmental justice. So in some of these urban centers, there's a lot of dialogue around how some of the lower income parts of those cities have less access to green space. They're often most disadvantaged and most exposed to the threats of climate change. And a lot of these threads are coming together to create the opportunity for green infrastructure. So green infrastructure is another one of the sort of hot words that people toss around. I wanted to put this slide up to sort of explain that there's a continuum when you talk about green infrastructure. So the continuum is from green to gray. And gray infrastructure is you know, in simplest terms, just pipes, right? It's urban drainage systems, concrete-based, related to how water goes from point A to point B. On the far left side is natural areas. So those are like your true wetland systems, your forested areas that are truly undeveloped. But really, it's a continuum, and there's a lot in between. So there certainly are rain gardens over here. That's a core of what we've implemented. But there's also projects that are kind of in between. So RES, for instance, implemented a very large, call it green, call it gray, infiltration project in the city of Philadelphia, which is where I live, under a parking lot. And would you call it a green infrastructure? Maybe. It was under a parking lot in like the stadiums, like the Phillies and Eagles stadium. So a very cool project. But again, when we talk about green infrastructure, it's important to kind of keep an open mind to what that means exactly in an urban setting. So what are stormwater mitigation markets? So they're kind of two, maybe three different avenues through which the private sector can get involved here. So the first are trading programs, and that's what I'm going to touch on most in the last couple slides here. Trading programs, as many of you are familiar, are where there's a tradable commodity between buyers and sellers. So just as you have wetland credits or carbon credits, you can have stormwater credits. And there's an opportunity in trading programs for private entities to voluntarily propose projects, just as you might in any other mitigation market, to generate credits and then ultimately sell those credits to a regulated community. So on the non-trading side, we have a couple different ways that this works. One are pay-per-performance contracts. So these are quite common in places like the Chesapeake Bay for things like water quality. They're also common in the stormwater context. This could be a city that's identified a couple of projects that they want to implement. They'll send out an RFP, and private entities can, of course, bid on those to implement those projects. There are also grant programs. So the city of Philadelphia, for instance, has a pretty robust grant program where anyone can propose a project, but it really doesn't operate like a trading program. It's really more like a grant. You're trying to get your project funded by the city, by the water department in Philadelphia. So I'm going to talk about a case study from D.C. This is one of our stormwater projects in the district. And I wanted to explain how the trading program works in the district. So the regulated community here in DC are basically anyone adding impervious surface to the landscape. So think about your like mid-rise apartment building, any sort of redevelopment of an area, a new housing project, whatever it might be, anything that's adding impervious surface. And then those projects, so those are like the ones on the left here, they will have a requirement to capture stormwater based on the amount of impervious surface that they're adding onto the landscape. They can either do that on site, so they can either make their project, extremely green, like to take that mid-rise apartment building example, they could build a green roof, and that could be a great draw for them and their particular building, but that can also be quite expensive. And so there's an opportunity for that developer to, instead of retrofitting their particular development, they can purchase credits to meet their compliance requirements. So in this example, this developer would need to purchase 5,000 gallons to meet compliance, and they're doing that by buying these things called SRCs. SRCs stand for Stormwater Retention Credits. I love this market because there's all sorts of new lingo that makes me sound smart. So here's our site, one of our sites, this Northeastern Presbyterian Church site in Northeast. Tying back to the earlier slide about how there are a couple different threads coming together here, the market in DC has been constructed in such a way as to incentivize green infrastructure projects in disadvantaged communities. So if you guys are familiar with DC, here's like the White House area, this is Northwest, and this is like Southeast. And some of these areas in Southeast, Anacostia, have been traditionally underserved and have less access to green spaces. And so the program in DC incentivizes private entities to develop these projects in those communities. And they do that by making those projects eligible for essentially an in-lieu fee program that I'll talk about in a few slides. So this is our project. Not pictured here is everything kind of behind it. One fun GIS mapping part of these projects is figuring out what water drains where. So it's very important to understand how water flows on a given project. A successful project in this landscape typically captures a lot of urban stormwater, and so you need to know where that water is flowing on a property. And so this is sort of at the bottom of a hill, basically, before it runs into the stormwater system, the gray infrastructure. So this is Florida Avenue, if you're familiar with DC. And then there's a pipe that like connects into that area, and all the water behind this would flow normally down this large parking lot and then into this stormwater system, this gray infrastructure. So this is during construction. And I like this slide because it kind of gives you a sense of like how big of an undertaking this stuff is. Like I think a lot of times you imagine green infrastructure like, oh, like, we're just going to plant a few trees and like put some mulch down and like, have a little ribbon cutting. These are often like very engineering heavy projects. I was personally very surprised by that. I think that's one of the challenges of having mitigation providers enter this space, because there are some unique qualities to these projects that make them look different than your typical stream restoration project, species restoration project. They're very engineering heavy, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong. We had a couple things almost go very wrong. And so it's just be mindful of that if you're entering into this universe. This is what it looked like at the end. Looks beautiful. We did not do the solar canopies, though. That was someone else. But water, you can see water now flowing down through the parking lot, enters into the basin, and then it's treated by all the plants and mulch and things, sand that captures that stormwater and ideally captures it on site before it flows into the gray infrastructure. So that ultimately reduces the stress on the system. And by doing that work, we were able to generate 52,000 SRCs, stormwater retention credits. There we go. So what do credit sales look like in DC? So there are basically two ways that you can generate revenue here. One is that the District of Columbia has essentially a glorified in lieu fee program called Price Lock. And what the city does essentially is, through their Department of Energy and Environment, if you develop projects that meet certain characteristics, one of those characteristics being that it's in one of these more disadvantaged parts of the city will buy those credits on spot at $2.03 an SRC per year. Another option is you can sell those SRC to regulated entities. So again, those can be your mid-rise apartment buildings, whoever's in the compliance community. And those can be structured in many different ways. They can be structured as yearly contracts. They can be structured as like a 12-year contract where they're buying all those credits up front. It's really like any other mitigation market. So some of the challenges here, the district is, they've done a lot of things I think really well. One of the challenges is that there have been some legacy projects that were granted a significant number of credits, and folks that have a regulated requirement to purchase those credits, there's just a supply and demand imbalance essentially. And so you can see here on the right, this is the price of SRCs over time since this program was started, and you can see, prices peaked at about $2.07, but have since dropped off pretty precipitously every year down to $1.39 per SRC. Now, the district has done some things well in response to this. They've introduced a subsidy program. So the city doesn't want every private entity to use the price lock program because it would drain public funds faster. So they've introduced, like I said, a subsidy program to incentivize folks to trade these commodities instead of just selling them to the district. They're also introducing new rules called a high-impact SRC rule, which is going to further raise prices for projects that meet certain characteristics. But I think this speaks to the challenge as an agency to find the right balance when you're creating a new mitigation market. For what it's worth, we sold our credits to Price Lock. Future outlook. So I think that as there's more attention on coastal and urban resiliency, this particular segment is likely to grow. I think it's worth mentioning that this work is already going on. It's a big segment of the environmental economy. It's just a lot of this work is currently done by these municipalities themselves or with engineering firms. So I think it's as much a question of how is this industry going to change and prioritize more green infrastructure as it is a question of how are mitigation firms going to get involved in lieu of, say, just your typical engineering or full delivery firm. These are some of the cities that have talked about green infrastructure in their recent MS4 permits. So some cities that are, other than DC, that are kind of talking about these topics right now include Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Cook County is developing a program, so that's in Chicago. Los Angeles, interestingly, is also developing a program. And Grand Rapids is another city that's taking some of the lessons from DC and implementing more of a trading program. So some of the challenges, I've mentioned some of these throughout, but one, these are just really complicated projects from a project management perspective, and we had to do things that we've never had to do before in any mitigation project. Traffic control plans, there's just all sorts of funky things when you're dealing with the city government and you're dealing with water and pipes and things that can go wrong. So just be mindful of all the complexity involved there. Municipal programs can be weird. They just are. Whether it's a grant program or a training program, there's just going to be some odd things that you get when you're dealing with a city that has a lot of different people trying to prioritize different things. And then, as I mentioned, there are just different perspectives on what we should prioritize here. So much like in the discussion around carbon, where it's a question of, do we just care about the raw amount of carbon that we're storing, or is it about some of the story of how we are, addressing issues around green access to green space or environmental justice, or how do we balance these different threats? I think those are ongoing topics that people are going to have to sort through in their respective projects. And the last challenge is just it's not just about building these projects, but also maintaining them. It makes sense for folks who do mitigation full time that you need to think about maintenance, but on a rain garden or a bioswale, we're talking about how those systems withstand extreme rainfall events. I think about a month after we developed that project I showed, there was remnants of some hurricane. They came through and dropped like 6 inches of rain and clogged one of the pipes, and we had to go out and clean it and stuff. So that stuff will happen when you're dealing with water, especially in an urban setting. Thanks.
Okay, with that, we have 10 minutes for some questions, and once again, just want to thank the entire panel. Want to thank the entire panel for being here and just sharing a lot of great information. I also, since someone gave me a mic, wanted to do an additional shout out to John for continuing to bring up the concept of environmental justice in disadvantaged communities, and I'm hoping as this conference moves into future years that that's a topic that we all can start bringing into our presentations more, and so there's my new soapbox. Okay, with that, questions, Rebecca, I saw your hand. Hold on, you need a microphone.
Thank you. Thanks everybody. John, I had a question about your price structure. So I know when we were structuring our program in Southern California, we looked at what you guys were doing for pricing, and how does that work in terms of term when you're paying per year, and what happens if the developer's gone, or how is that funding addressed long term?
Yeah, so just so I'm clear on the question, it's about how how those contracts are structured between
and the
buyers and
long-term insurance of funds, as we have a lot of our development is done by an LLC.
Mm-hmm.
And so another program in our region was looking at making an LLC sign on to permanent maintenance of stormwater BMPs like that, and I looked at that and was like, well, they're going to be gone in 5 years, so that's useless. But I'm assuming that you guys have already thought through that, and I wanted to know what you guys did to address it.
Yeah, what's interesting is in a lot of other things we do, we have to figure out endowment funds and long-term maintenance and things like that. In DC, for this particular market, it's only the maximum term that the city contemplates for this thing is, I think it's 12 years, it might be 15. So you really just need to develop a plan and budget for those maintenance items for 12 years. But I think year 3, you have to go back and there's a site visit that occurs at year 3 to make sure that the site is still performing all the functions that it needs to perform. But it's just like any other mitigation project, you need to think through the long term. But for this, the long term is just 12 years. It's not permanence.
So do you know if the city is, sorry, just going to take over. Does the city speculate that in 12 to 15 years, somebody else will go in and replace that? Is that the life term that they see for that BMP?
Yeah, I think that after that period of time, you could recertify it. But I'm not quite, this program's only been around for 6 years, so
Not 12 years yet.
You're probably asking questions that nobody quite knows the answer to.
Cool.
No, that's a good, I'm curious about you don't actually have to answer this now, but to continue down that, I'm wondering, because the impact is going to be there for longer than 12 years, and so I'm curious what those programs look like. You don't have to answer that now, but how we address that. Other questions? Yeah, we can come back to that if nobody has any questions. Jennifer, I see a hand up. Oops.
Mindy, my question is for you. Does the state ever anticipate needing to buy credits from any of the mitigation banks for your own projects?
Okay. No, I don't think so. Well, it's possible that our lessees might, but we wouldn't be involved directly with that transaction.
Okay,
So,
I was just curious how the credit pricing would work, if you
Right.
needed it yourself, since you own
that would be
the
an
leases.
interesting discussion.
Yeah, a question regarding a private entity doing work on BLM land, whether it's, mitigation bank or soil carbon project or whatever. Would there likely be a requirement for NEPA documentation, CADX or an EA? And would that be, do you know which it would be, a CADX or an EA?
Well, we wouldn't know that till we had the project in front of us. But yeah, we definitely would have to do NEPA on that. BLM probably does more NEPA than anybody I know. Maybe the Corps Civil Works, I don't know. But you're pretty good at that. Now, there is a cost involved. If we're doing the NEPA, we can collect cost share money from so that would be an added cost to the project. But yeah, definitely would have to do NEPA. And I'm thinking for banks or these, unless it's a huge restoration project, it would probably just be an EA.
I have a question for Michelle from Louisiana, and it's probably about 3 years ago there was an announcement that the Sustainable Rivers Program would be implementing a e-flows approach, Sustainable Rivers approach on the Atchafalaya River. Kind of met with a lot of resistance from amongst some of the landowners that would be affected because they were not included in some of the early planning. I was wondering, I haven't heard much about it lately. Can you give an update on where that's at?
Well, we have, so there's 44 rivers. I think there's 34 active in planning, but the Atchafalaya I know is moving forward. And so I completely missed the opportunity to say that SRP started with environmental flows. So e-flows is just managing the flows out of a facility to get better environmental benefits or any environmental benefits, right? But yeah, the program is moving forward. And again, as we've grown, we've started to develop program level guidance, if you will, that is not quite final, but in draft form, and at the national meeting we'll be reviewing those things, which includes not a hard and fast requirement for stakeholder involvement, but a strong recommendation for that. So location-based teams are supposed to do a suite of things in their advanced phase. Stakeholder involvement, engage their local TNC office, talk to operations if the application comes in through planning and so on. So that program, if I remember correctly, because I just did the annual report a couple months ago, is moving forward and hopefully have dealt with that stakeholder involvement. But you can go to the website or reach out to me separately and I can pull up any new information I have on any of the sites.
And I have a quick go back. So I think it's Kent. I think I said cost share. I meant to say cost recovery. That's the correct term.
No,
Mine's
yes.
actually related to that for Lindsay. I've done some work with BLM doing restoration, and it seems like often the bottleneck is the archaeological and cultural review, just because of the limited staffing there, and a lot of projects, it kind of is a bottleneck for the whole federal review. And so I just wanted to verify, if a bank came in, can we take care of the NEPA, contract the ARC review, all of that cultural review, and then BLM can just review that as part of the whole thing? Is there a way we can, basically I'm asking, can we as private investors help with that bottleneck to basically take care of that as well and streamline your whole process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is yes. I mean, I will check on that for you. If you shoot me an email or something, I'll check on that for you. But I'm pretty sure that answer is yes. Yes.
Hi, another question for Devlin. I think I noticed on one of your slides you mentioned that the lease term for the mitigation bank would need to be at least equal or greater than the impact project. So I'm assuming the market for, since you don't usually have an impact project on a mitigation bank prior to the bank being established, so you're limiting the market to temporary projects or temporary impacts?
Yeah, no, so I think this slide, I think it's the length of the lease would need to be commensurate with the duration of the impacts. Now, I'm glad you asked that question, because let's say the duration of the impacts is 60 years. We're probably not going to do a 60-year lease. We would probably do something like a 20-year, 25-year lease with a right to renew going forward, and then seeing each time it's up for renewal if it needs to be renewed or not. So is that kind of getting at what you were asking?
Yeah, well,
or not quite.
Yeah, so mitigation banks are usually established before there's an impact project, so then they sell within a service area. So you wouldn't know how long your impact's going to be.
Oh, yeah.
With your
Get
the bank.
commensurate
Oh,
with the-
yeah, got it. Yeah, I think we'd probably do something like, and it's hard to say. Actually, the proposed rule we have out now, that is one of the questions we're asking the public to comment on. How long should these leases be, whether they're just for straight conservation purposes or for mitigation purposes. And so that would really be helpful to get some feedback from the public on what you think the term should be. The one that we started out doing, kind of our pilot one, we decided 20 years was a good number for this DOT single user bank that they wanted to do.
Okay, so in that case, you knew what the impact was, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
And that was for wetland restoration, stream restoration.
okay, yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think it's 10, and I'm supposed to be respectful of everybody's time. That's what they also told me to do. So otherwise, we just stay here talking all day. So thank you all for being here. I'm pretty sure all our panelists are around for the rest of today, and in general, I'm sure are still interested in having awesome conversations. So you guys have a good rest of your morning.